Hello students, today we are going to talk about the module on caste, class and gender. Now, the learning objectives of this particular module is to examine the structure of Indian society through the structural categories of caste, class and gender, and also to understand the determining influence of caste, to elaborate the influence of class as a system, and to examine the intersecting inequalities of caste, class and gender. Now, if we were to elaborate the role of these three structural dimensions of Indian society, it would be clear that these three aspects, namely caste, class and gender, are pivots of all social relations that India has witnessed and which interact and overlap to create the complexities of lived realities in our country. These stratificatory axes emerge as the most foundational aspects that organize our Indian society. The continued relevance of caste in contemporary era is clearly evident because caste still persists as a form of social stratification, despite the understanding of the Western scholars on India that castes would disappear with modernization. This has not happened. The systematic patterns of privilege and disprivilege that is seen in Indian society still shapes the life chances of an individual, and this has to do with his or her caste membership. The class system has not been successful in annihilating caste altogether. In fact, the two work together, they coexist with each other and they are intensely competitive and complex. We witness this when we look at the access to educational opportunities, to employment opportunities, to any future prospects that an individual has in our society. This is shaped by his or her class location, which in turn is influenced by the caste membership of that particular individual. Now, if one were to look at gender, gender-based inequalities are deeply rooted in our society, which is patriarchal in nature, and although this is a very basic and a foundational characteristic, gender as a category has been relatively neglected or bypassed over caste and class. For understanding, if you were to look at practices like sex selective abortion, if you were to look at practices like female infanticide or mounting rates of violence on women, we need to recognize that Indian society has a gendered dimension as well, and each of these particular axes, they shape the way in which we live in this particular society. If one were to look at the institution of caste, the lens of caste is to be understood through the two terms Varna and Jati. Castes generally are defined as hereditary endogamous groups which have shared values, ideals and practices, and caste system as a system has a religious basis. Now, caste can be understood through the phenomena of two frequently used terms, namely Varna and Jati. While Varna is the textual understanding of caste, the textual view of caste, Jati is the practical view of caste, the practice of caste in everyday life. So, Varna refers to the pan-Indian hierarchical structure. It also has a racial theory which underlies our understanding of Varna, in the sense that people are structured on the basis of their color of their skin, on the basis of their features, etc. And Varna also corresponds to a fourfold division of Indian society into three twice born castes, namely Brahmin, Kshatriya and Vaishya, and the fourth, which is the lowest, namely the Shudra caste. Now, Jatis occupy a different domain, namely we get a sense of the Jatis when we undertake a field view of caste. Jatis are basically occupational categories which refer to subcastes or sub-subcastes, and these are categories which are empirically observable. Unlike the Varna category, the Jatis are empirically observable. They are specific to a region, they are generally numerous, and Jati is the operative dimension of caste. Now, another difference between the Varna and the Jati is that while the fourth Varna, namely the Shudras, are excluded from the structuring of the caste system, they are included in different Jati level organizations. Now, in order to understand the determining influence of caste, we have to say, or we have to take note of the fact that capitalism has adjusted itself with a pre-capitalist institution like caste, and in the field of modern education, urbanization, industrialization, it has not annihilated it. Similarly, caste loyalties, as we see, become very important in political mobilizations, and they act as ways of mobilizing support around particular caste groups. Now, there is a distinctive dimension to this, that political leaders often used their caste based affiliations to mobilize support from their own brethren. The rise of parties like the Bahujan Samaj Party is emblematic of this drive for political mobilization amongst the lower caste groups. On the other hand, opposition against caste based reservation and quotas still persist in the field of education and employment, but caste groups have managed to influence a new kind of a political consciousness amongst the people as lower castes try to claim and gain power in this changing opportunity structures. If one were to look at the marriage advertisements today in the daily newspapers, one would see the persistence of caste and its norms like endogamy. Caste based violence against members of the lower castes for crossing the caste boundaries is another example of showing how caste works in Indian society. Now, if you look at the middle order castes, there is a considerable loosening of the association between caste and occupation, but if you look at certain lower order castes, there is caste clustering, and caste clustering is still very important. There are intense contestation between landowning peasant castes as well as the lower landless Dalit laborers we see in the countryside. Also, this cleavage between castes is the highest, it is the deepest between the Savarnas and the Avarnas, namely the non-Dalits and the Dalits in the political, cultural, social and economic arena. Now, let me come to class. Class as a system has an economic basis, and it also has traditionally ascribed status differences in non-modern locale, but primarily class as a category, a sociological category, is distinguished on the basis of antagonism between bourgeois and the proletariat classes according to the Marxist perspective. Similarly, according to the Weberian perspective, the market is a very important aspect which determines the class location. The market capacities of selling one's skills is similar amongst people who are placed in the same class. Therefore, inequalities and life chances according to Weber would be shaped by the class location. Similarly, if you look at Erik Olin Wright theory, he would say that the middle class are an extremely important group, they are an ideologically powerful group in the capitalist order, and they survive with the legitimacy, with sustenance by being part of this capitalist order. So, therefore, there are these different perspectives which show that social class is an indispensable axis of social stratification. Now, let us come to the difference between caste and class. Now, the boundaries between classes are not as significant and as watertight as the boundary between castes. Fluidity is possible, mobility is possible to some extent. The caste system again is said to have a divine origin, whereas class is considered to be more secular. Similarly, if you look at the membership in a particular caste, it is membership by birth. So, ascribed status characterizes caste membership, whereas in class membership can technically in principle be achieved. Another important aspect of caste is that endogamy is essential in order to perpetuate caste as a system. Members of a particular caste generally tend to marry within one's own group, because caste has a cultural dimension to it as well. So, the principle of endogamy is not so significant as far as class is concerned. Another dimension of difference is occupational mobility and the degree of occupational mobility. The degree of occupational mobility is absent in the caste system, and in the class system there is still a degree of autonomy given to the individual as far as his occupation is concerned. Now, though we talked about the differences between caste and class, in social reality, as an empirically observable category, caste and class have a considerable amount of overlap, and we will discuss the overlap now. Both caste and class, though they are perceived as polar opposites, there is an understanding that caste will give way to class with modernity, with the advancement of modernity. Now, this perception of a dichotomous view of both caste and class, according to the Western scholarship, is not considered as suitable in the Indian context. If we were to look at the Indian middle classes consists of members of both upper and lower caste groups, but the proportion of the upper castes is definitely higher than the lower castes. Similarly, members of the upper castes and upper find preferences because of their cultural and material advantages like white collar occupation, income, membership of certain networks, etc. Lower caste members who are part of the middle class, they have certain disadvantages and they find it difficult to move up the social ladder. Similarly, if one were to go back to the time of the Green Revolution, one would see that new classes emerged with the Green Revolution, and although the poor peasants were able to take advantage of the situation of the Green Revolution, they lacked the adequate capital to purchase machineries, seeds, equipment, which then difficult for them to transcend their class status. Similarly, if you look at the formerly landowning upper castes, they have now become the rich peasants and they have taken to agriculture as self-cultivators. Now, in the context of agrarian society in India, migration allows lower castes to take up jobs in different areas, so that class membership and their individual location can undergo a change. This is known as the process of embourgeoisement, and here caste and class as categories interact. Now, in another situation, a caste may resemble a class and a power block, and yet it remains a caste. Now, this caste and class power nexus needs to be investigated, needs to be noted as a dynamic dimension of the various aspects of Indian social order. Now, let us come to the last category, namely the importance of gender. Now, what the feminist intervention has done is that gender is now being recognized in the academic discourses. Now, the overarching context in which gender emerges as a form, as a repressive tool, is the patriarchal society, which is deeply sort of disdainful of the role of women. The influence of gender, wherein I would like to draw on the works of V. Gita, who says that the notions of patriarchy is identified by the subordination of women and the role of institutions in particular contexts, which remain under masculine control. So, for example, the institutions of family or marriage primarily, workspace, etc., have a deep imprint of the masculinist power, which restricts the way in which women access or women participate in these particular social institution. In fact, it is predetermined by the masculine control in such a manner that women's participation becomes structured around a given script, which reduces their autonomy. Now, women's subordinate status is also accorded due to the lack of control over resources like land, like labor, etc. These are in turn supported by notions of family, marriage, religion, etc., which uphold the patriarchal character of the social order. Now, Uma Chakravarti would say in her work Gendering Caste through a Feminist Lens, published in 2013, that there is a need for an integrated and an intersectional approach to understand the role of gender in society, because it is rather multi-layered and complex. The social reality is not as evident as it may appear to be. The complexities of the lived experiences of women in particular castes and the nature of disadvantages and atrocities that they experience cannot be only understood as through a caste lens. Therefore, the critical feminist intervention that Uma Chakravarti advocates would try to see caste as a core dimension of investigation of Indian social structure, but also take into consideration gender, the way in which gender is interwoven, it is lived, the way in which it is intertwined, and therefore enables us to make sense of the role of gender in society. Women live their lives at the intersection of caste, class and patriarchy. This is specifically seen in the lives of Dalit women, whose opportunities and experiences of oppression are shaped by their social location as Dalit women. They experience power on a day-to-day basis, and they are subordinated by the patriarchal structure of their male counterparts, or even women in upper classes who may have social power, may have resources, economic resources by virtue of their caste and class location, but they are able to oppress the Dalit women because of their position, lowly position. The caste-based patriarchal order emerged with the growth of agrarian society, and it was in these agrarian societies that the control of women was first achieved by the upper caste groups through the practice of endogamy. Maintaining the purity of women was a very, very important aspect in maintaining the purity of caste group as well. And therefore, most of the time when women transgress these positions, they experience violence of a very high order. For example, if you look at the honor killings that persist in particular parts of UP, Haryana, etc., is because women and men have transgressed their caste-based boundaries and have made a choice which is violative of the social order buttressed by caste norms. The state also aids in acting as an accessory to this oppression rather than redeeming the lower caste women from this oppression, because the experience of violence is often erased by the casteist state apparatus. Upper caste perpetrators are acquitted on the pretext that they cannot violate the caste norms, especially regarding sexual relationships. They cannot violate the sexual relationships, whereas this allows the exercise of caste privilege on the bodies of Dalit women. The notion of the concept of honor then becomes a link between the behavior of the individual woman and the idealized norms of the community. Therefore, intercaste marriages are often tabooed under the institutional norms of endogamy. and because it amounts to be a transgression. The other point that I want to make here is how Dalit women are trying to organize themselves. They are trying to talk differently because they want to escape Dalit patriarchy. There have been emergence of several organizations like Shramik Mukti Sangatana and others during 1970s and the 1980s who have called for a reinvention of revolution. These organizations have accorded Dalit women a more extensive form of representation than the tokenism which is seen in mainstream discourse. The tendency of the upper caste woman and the upper class women to co-opt the voices of Dalit women have also been intensely problematic. Therefore, Dalit women have always had to exercise alertness and a kind of attempt to mobilize against upper caste women and against the Dalit men in order to make a mark in not only academic discourse, but also political discourse. Otherwise, they would be relegated to the margins of both academic discourse as well as social life. Therefore, Sharmila Rege advocates that we should develop, that there should be a need to develop an epistemological standpoint in order to assess the mobilization of Dalit women. Dalit women talk differently. This talking differently will foreground the identity of the Dalit women, wherein the lived experiences of the Dalit women would become a tool through which they mobilize against both the upper caste people, both men and women, and also Dalit men. Let me come to the conclusion of this particular module, where we will recount some of the main points that we dealt with. Now, in this particular module, we have seen how caste, class and gender act as axis of social stratification in order to develop a critical understanding of the structure of Indian society. Since the categories of Varna and Jati may be used synonymously, but there exist important differences between these categories of Varna and Jati, while one being ideologically shaped by the racial theory of caste, the other being referring to the more operative principles of Indian society. If one were to look at class structure, one would see how the caste and class, despite several differences, they overlap, and the Indian middle class seems to be an example of how caste and class overlaps are accommodated. Gender again is an essential determinant of the inequalities encountered in Indian society, and in the context of gender we discussed specifically the example of Dalit women, because the lives of Dalit women embody and reflect the intersection of inequalities that we see in terms of caste, class and gender.